So now we have our simulation points over here, and we can talk about how we can optimize the terrain. So if we look at our terrain, and I will template this, we can see that the terrain is rather large, so it's covering an area of 100 units on any direction, and we really don't need to fracture all of this terrain. We only really need to fracture this part here that the points are covering. So following this logic, let's go ahead and let's try to first create a fracture for our terrain that sort of encapsulates the area that these points cover. So over here I will grab this HF geo node, and I will Control C to copy this, and over here I'll just make some room maybe, and I will actually close this tab, and I'll just press P to have a little bit more of a real estate to work with. Alright, so I will drop down an object merge, and I will just simply place this node, so Control C, and I will paste this here inside the object merge. Alright, so here we have our terrain, and let's maybe actually just organize some of these nodes a bit. So this whole thing, I will grab all of these nodes and I will press Shift O, and let's make some room. And over here I will press Shift P to create a sticky node, place this over here, right click and set the text size to large. Or actually, let's just set this to medium. And this can become height field. Let's say init for initialization. And make this smaller and sort of arrange things a little bit. Alright, so here we create our height field. And let's grab this object merge. And from here, we want a cutter object to generate our first fracture. So I will simply use a tube for this. And let's template this geometry. Let's also hold down Shift and template our points as well. And let's take a look at the points here. So we know we want this tube to encapsulate the points. And here is our tube. And I'll just set the radius here to maybe 20 and 20. Okay, and maybe actually just make this a little bit bigger just to be sure. So we can see that where the points end up, now our tube will sort of cover the whole area. Let's maybe increase the columns. Let's maybe set this to 100. And in order for our cutting operation to work, this needs to intersect with our terrain, obviously. So let's set the height. Let's maybe just increase this. Alright, so maybe a value of 7 will be fine. And we also need this geometry to be filled. So if I look at my geometry, so let's make sure that this geometry is filled on both sides, and now we can start doing our fracturing. So let's plug this terrain geo inside a boolean, and before I plug this tube into the second input, let's set our settings. So first I will set the operation to be intersect, and if I plug this in now and let's take a look at the result, we can see that we isolate this part in the center here, and we also have an object with depth. Okay, so normally you would have to set this to the first input, so set A. We should technically need to set this to be a surface because our terrain object doesn't have any volume. Alright, so it's not really a solid object, so we would have to set this as a surface. But when we do this, we get the intended result, right? So if I were to untemplate this, we get what we expect, but we also need our initial fracture geometry to have depth to it. So I will just set this to solid, and now it will grab the solid portion of the tube and mix it in with our surface terrain. Okay, so from here, let's just drop down a null, and I will set this to be, let's say, geo init. Alright, so this will be our initial geometry that we will subfracture later. Also in this boolean node, we want to output primitive groups, and we want the A inside B geometry. So if from here I were to drop down a blast, we can see that this is now our surface geometry. So if I were to delete non-selected, we have a group that contains all of our primitives that are from our original surface of the terrain. So this will come important later. Alright, so let's just get rid of this blast node because we won't be needing it. And I also want our exterior geometry as well of the terrain, so I will just hold down Alt and drag this over. And for the second boolean node, we will need the operation to be subtract. Alright, then let's preview this. So we can see that we get the expected result only for our subtract operation, we actually don't need to have depth for this terrain. So we can set this to treat as surface. Okay, so we only need this to be the surface geometry of the terrain. So let's drop down a null, and this can become geo ext for exterior, and actually I will rename this one to geo int for interior. So geo interior and geo exterior. Alright, so from here let's make some room again and place these here, and I can encapsulate all of this with Shift O, and I will grab one of these sticky notes and paste this here, and this can become let's just name this to geo setup. Alright, so this is the piece, so this geo int, this geo interior is the piece that we will create our fractures on, but we don't really need this to be this, we don't really need to work with this much depth on the y-axis. So really what needs to happen here is that the lightning or the base of the effect will only affect the surface portion of this terrain. So what I mean by this is that the lightning itself doesn't need to go all the way, so travel all of this distance over here. So what we need to do is limit this depth that the lightning can travel. And I will grab this geoint node and I will do an object merge over here below it. And let's place this here and preview this node. Okay, so from here I want to blast this surface area over here that we isolated earlier, so A inside B and delete non-selected. And if I were to drop down a transform node from here, I can also preview our original terrain. And with this transform node, I will just set the translate Y. I will just move this below negative 0.5 units. Okay, so this is really the surface that the depth that I want to simulate. And we can now use this as a cutter plane for our original terrain. So also with this transform node selected, I will maybe increase the uniform scale just a little bit, so 0.01, just to make sure that it goes outside of the regions of our original terrain. Okay, so now if I were to drop this into a Boolean fracture, so the reason we are using a Boolean fracture instead of the regular Boolean is because we also want to generate, we want to start generating our name attribute. Okay, so place this here, and if I were to preview this, now we should have two pieces over here. So if I were to toggle this visualization icon on and toggle it here as well, we can see that we have one thin slice of our terrain, and then we have this second piece here that will act as our base. So let's maybe just increase the depth a little bit. So instead of 0.5, let's maybe go with 6. Okay, so just add a little bit more depth. So from here we can separate the pieces now. So if I were to drop a split node from our first input, we can select in the group, let's say piece 0. Alright, so we can see here, if I drop down a null, let's maybe invert this selection, and this can become our surface geometry. So let's maybe rename this to geo surface, and let's copy this null and place the second input into this second null, and this can become geo base. Okay, so we have our surface and then we have our base. So this geo surface is again the geometry that we will create our main fracturing on. The problem here is that if I were to select this surface portion, so this is the A inside B group, if I were to drop down a blast and preview this and set this to be A inside B, we can see if I go to select delete non-selected, we can see now that this A inside B group also has the surface piece, but also this base over here. And this is because we duplicated this A inside B polygon group, and so this carried over to our Boolean fracture. What we need to do here is we need to rename this group over here before we do the fracturing. So I will drop down an attribute, or rather a group rename node, and let's preview this, and this will be A inside B, and I will just rename this to B back. Alright, and if I were to go to my blast node and create our new fracturing, we can see now that from this geo surface, if I were to select this A inside B, we only have this top area. And we can also drop down a second blast, and if I were to select my back, we have control over our back polygons as well. Alright, so this will become important later on. So to keep things organized, all of these can now become, let's press Shift O with all of these selected. Make some room over here. Grab one of these sticky notes. And let's just rename this to Geo. Let's set this Geo init. So initial Geo. And we have our geosurface and our geobase. So now we can move further and create our first cutters and our first fracturing.